Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're going to get rolling. So, welcome everyone to the Potomac River Jazz Club's monthly jazz talk featuring Bill Edwards on Ragtime Revivals since the 40s. We're really excited for tonight's chat. All of you who are here have read his bio or know him, so I'm not going to take up too much time with that. But let's just say we're really excited for the program and reminding everybody to mute your microphones until he asks for questions. And we will be recording the session and posting it later on YouTube. So if there's anything you want to rewatch or check later, that will be available to you. So everybody lock down those mics. Off to the races.
Well, good evening. My name is Bill Edwards. I am a professional purveyor of pleasingly pianistic pyrotechnics. In other words, I love ragtime. I have loved it my whole life. I have. What are we seeing now? Are we seeing my graphic again, or let me just share it? Oh, good. Okay. So I can't hear you.
We're seeing you.
We're seeing
For some
you.
reason, it took when I took hosting away, it took that back. So I'm going to leave you there, and I'm going to go in on a second device to try to manage it. So you're good. Go for it.
All right. Thank you. There we go. So we'll do this screen again. PowerPoint.
Now we can't hear you, or I can't hear you.
How about now?
I can hear Bill.
Okay. Well, if it's everyone else can hear me, yay, we can get going, right? Okay, good. All right. So, yeah, I've been in. Uh-oh. Did my graphic go away again?
Okay. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Can you also hear Bill?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry. I lost.
So this is a continuing saga of the Zoom Comedy Hour. Used to be a vaudeville show.
All right, here we are. No more interruptions, I hope, because this is a finely honed presentation. It's a large one. So Potomac River Jazz Club presents me. And tonight I will be talking about the revolution of the first ragtime revival. It's not often referred to as that, but it actually was. So ragtime revivals, past, present, and future. So we're going to be coming up to now, keeping it all alive, the difficult but predictable ups and downs of ragtime in popular media. And boy, are there ups and downs. If anyone can figure that out, that is the maple leaf rag that you're seeing there. At least part of it measures 9 through 12, which is one of our big symbols of ragtime. I have been involved with ragtime for a long time. When I was 5 years old, I was going through a divorce. Wasn't mine. It wasn't mine. It was my parents. I was a little young at the time. But my dad had some of these 10-inch records from the 1950s. He seemed to like ragtime, and he'd left them all behind. I had this little record player. I was technically able to figure out where to put the needle. And I listened to Frankie Carle and Joe Fingers Carr and the Firehouse Five and all kinds of ragtime nonsense on these 10-inch discs. And I became enamored with it. And then I learned how to play on my little harmonium. That's one of those little blow pianos in the internet. I learned how to play Yes Sir, That's My Baby. And I showed my mom, and she was thrilled, except for the fact that it was 6 a.m. in her bedroom. So she asked her father to get a piano here in California. It's a ranch house, and put the piano at the other end where it was hard to hear me when I went to play at 6:30 in the morning. Now I'm a musician. I don't get up before 9, so it all pans out. Anyhow, that's my involvement in ragtime, and this goes back to the 1960s. So I knew about Maple Leaf Rag and the Entertainer and whatnot in that gap between the second to last Lou Busch recording, which is 1963, and his last one in 1975. And it was well before the Sting and all that. So I was in not quite at the beginning, a little young for that. So I know it's dramatic. Ragtime is dead, long live ragtime. Well, this is, of course, after the 1920s. A lot of the jazz in the 1920s was ragtime, ostensibly so. It was, the Charleston was a little bit of ragtime, and a lot of these composers had been playing ragtime and were switching to, Fats Waller had learned it, and James P. Johnson, and Al Jolson had been singing it, as had Eddie Cantor. So it was still in the air, but by 1930, things changed. Let's start with the Great Depression. There were changing tastes and moods. Of course, the mood of the country was from conga line into bread line, and that wasn't really helpful. The music industry got hit kind of hard because where the staples in the 1910s and 20s had been sheet music and piano rolls, and once they got electronic recording, records became improved. Well, something new came in, and that was radio. And as long as you could afford the occasional radio tube to keep your radio maintenance, it was ostensibly free. So sheet music suffered because of that. And live performers actually made pretty good with it, but the record industry was pretty much hurt. And that didn't help ragtime. Also look at where it was heard, less in the public venues, more often at grandma's house. This is going to come into play as to why we had a revival, because a lot of these kids in the 1920s, who were born in the 1920s and the 1930s, could hear grandma play the stuff she remembered from when she was young, which might include the Maple Leaf Rag or Black and White or the like. It was relegated to period films and cartoon soundtracks. I've gone through the entire catalog of Disney films. I have all of the cartoons on DVD somewhere, and found over 100 examples of ragtime in there. Most common was 12th Street Rag, followed by Black and White Rag, but there is Maple Leaf in there, Down Home. It's amazing, quite a few. And then another 60 or 70 included in Warner Brothers cartoons, which should not be surprising because the primary composer for the Warner Brothers from the late 30s forward was Carl Stalling, who had started with Disney and was a silent film pianist in Kansas City in the 1920s. The scene that you see below is from The Public Enemy, which does play a role in one of the revivals, as you will hear. Of course, James Cagney. There was quite a bit of ragtime in that, and it was in context because they're talking about the rise of gangsters from the 1910s forward. So you are going to hear the pieces like 12th Street Rag and quite a few of the songs of the era, Ball and the Jack, they're contained in that film. But that's where you heard it in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And it was replaced by trends led largely by film music. Those of you know the magnificent Frederick Hodges and Adam Swanson, they also favor this, and they play a lot of film music as well. Some of those great composers, Harold Arlen, of course, is a favorite, but so many from that era who provided soundtracks for RKO and MGM, and they weren't ragtime, that's for certain. Fewer ragtime artists were recording, less were writing. We see the wonderful Willie the Lion Smith giving directions to Fats Waller, or maybe it was the other way around, I'm not sure, in Harlem. And over on the right side, you'll see Babe Ruth. Sitting at the piano is, of course, Zez Confrey, and over on the left side there is Gay. Edward, now I can't remember. Well, you all know who I'm talking about. Wrote The Vamp, among other pieces. So George Gay, yeah. One of those things. All right, I thought I was prepared, but anyhow, that's from a little short home run on the keys from the mid 1930s. But it wasn't really ragtime, it was more novelty. And then, of course, there were social changes in the country, trends with African American blues and swing music, which made it further out of vogue. Left, of course, Lady Day. On the right side, the band of Count Basie. And that was the type of music they were hearing in the 30s swing music. Basie didn't play no ragtime. So how did it become popular again? Well, it took almost a decade. One of the first things that happened in the 1940s is one of the originators of ragtime, and he says the inventor of jazz, tried to get his footing back again after being reviewed by Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress. Jelly Roll Morton tried to get active just a little bit too soon. His health suffered as a result. He died in July 1941 out in California. But this made the news, and people said, oh, yeah, Jelly Roll. I remember him. And then for a minute, they thought about ragtime. But in San Francisco, there was a group of guys really thinking about the ragtime and the traditional jazz. Lou Waters, Yerba Buena Jazz Band, and their pianist of note from the early, actually, I think 1939, would be Wally Rose. You can hear the Maple Leaf rag in the background there. And that was the first single that they released. And the backside of it was black and white rag. And it was recorded by Lester Koenig, who would later help found Good Time Jazz Records. Then World War II interrupted the attempts at a revival, although you wouldn't know that in the film industry because they started the revival early. There's Meet Me in St. Louis, you can see, in the good old summertime. Take Me Out to the Ball Game, On Moonlight Bay, By the Light of Silvery Moon. All of these were popular, particularly because of the music and what they evoked. And there were other stories like the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, which had quite a bit of ragtime in it. And the servicemen came home to a much different America, and they were looking for something much more familiar. Of course, we see Al Jolson. Oh, there's another one of our characters. Al Jolson, Bing Crosby, and Benny Goodman, which is a lot of what they heard on the V-discs when they were overseas, including with Fats Waller. But things had changed while they were gone in 4 years, and they were looking for something familiar from the past. And that's something, you will find out pretty soon, would be comfort to them. Waters Rose and the Yerba Buena Jazz Band recorded again in 1946 through 1948 for Lester Koenig, and this time they always featured Wally on 1 or 2 ragtime cuts for every 8 they did, originally on 4 10-inch LPs and later on these 3 12-inch LPs. So that became popular, but again, it was niche. It wasn't something national. You had to know that Lou Waters and those exist. And then the musicians' strike against recording in 1948, where the leader of the musicians union said the record companies were being unfair to musicians. They may or may not have. One guy who did not agree was the owner of Capitol Records, Johnny Mercer, who had started that label in 1942 and seen some serious decline during World War II. And he was one of the first to get back in the graces. But this recording strike actually plays a role in the first ragtime revival. Let's find out how. First, we'll talk about what I like to call a technological convergence, a confluence of great technology that immediately followed the war. Some of it brought back from Europe, some of it developed by us during the war, and it created better sound. One of the first was Mr. Armstrong's FM radio, which allowed a much higher bandwidth of music to be spread about. Although it wasn't initially used for music, oddly enough, it took a while to find that. But it was available. And in order to make the best use of it and the better technology for films, they needed the condenser microphone. It's an electric microphone. Many radio stations didn't think they had any use for this in the early 1940s because it had a frequency range going up to almost 10,000 hertz. And the highest you could usually get on AM radio then was about 3,000. So it seemed useless, and all of a sudden it was now indispensable because of the frequency range, which is up to 15,000 by this time. And then there was the interloper, the thing that really changed. It used FM radio for its sound and also transmitted pictures, then television. which the film industry saw obviously as a threat, and radio did as well. So they had to do something to try and get listeners back, and record companies as well. And this is during a recording strike, which is particularly hard because now they have the advent of magnetic tape from the Ampex Corporation. Magnetic tape, of course, developed in Germany as late as the late 1930s and very popular there, mostly during the war effort, 1944, 45. Many of the servicemen brought back Grundigs and other type of recorders, and then the Ampex Corporation was formed and funded by this guy, Der Bingle. Now, my dad is an actor, so I grew up in Hollywood, and he was an acquaintance of Bing's. They worked together now and then. And he liked to tell the story how in 1948, when Bing was getting the funding for Ampex, he was also getting the funding for this Minnesota mining company out in Minnesota, obviously, 3M. So they're making this great thing. They have Mylar, and they're putting rust on the Mylar. And my dad was like, what? And you're going to record something on that? He says, oh, it's the future, Sam. It's the future. Well, he did buy stock in 3M. He made thousands instead of millions because he bought it 2 years later. But just the same, Bing Crosby, we owe a lot to for high fidelity sound, the capture of that sound, and for videotape as well, because he funded these technologies. Then, of course, also in 1948, introduced the 45 RPM record. That was RCA Victor's answer to the 78. Said, yeah, it's still got the 4-minute limit, but it's smaller and it's more flexible. Yeah, but it's still got the limit. And then Columbia at the same time brought out the LP. Now, the original bandwidth that the LP came out with was for 22 minutes a side. The reason for that is a similar reason for the CD original 74 minutes. Reason for that is that one of the heads of Columbia asked his wife, what classical work do you like that you'd like to hear uninterrupted? And she said, the Nutcracker Suite. So the engineers worked to the point where 33 and third RPM, they could reliably get the Nutcracker Suite on one side of a record. And later it was expanded. There were some records as long as 90 minutes at some point, but typically 45, 50 minutes was typical. So Columbia was responsible for that, but nobody could do anything. All they could do was release older material until the middle of the year. And that comes into play as part of the technological convergence. So another factor that came into play was a book. But before the book, there were magazine articles and so on, but we know what the book is. The book came out in 1950, but it had been reviewed before then. They all played ragtime, and there was actually something that came out before that. You can see yeah, they're alive. I know, they're alive. A little creepy, but I like it. It's fun. So Rudy Blesch over there. The only picture I've ever seen of Harriet Janis. Took some doing, but I got it going. But what a lot of people don't know is that a year before this book came out, Rudy, who had been active, obviously, in the world of jazz, arranged for a concert in New York at the Carl Fisher Auditorium. And look at the numbers on here. Maple Leaf Rag, the Eccentric Rag, Clarinet Marmalade, not quite ragtime, the Sensation. Boy, Grace and Beauty's in there, Swipesy, Sunflower Slow Drag, Dill Pickles. It was quite a bit. So Tony Parente, and many of you know who he is, was the guy who headed up this particular concert in Midtown Manhattan and was responsible somewhat, but this came actually after the big phenomenon we're going to talk about next. So what happened? Well, remember, there was a recording strike, but Capitol Records was also doing transcriptions, and those transcriptions were for radio stations primarily. And in order to fulfill that, some of the bands that they engaged, that even if they weren't releasing on the label at the time, would stop from time to time in a town that had a magnetic recorder and do a side of 25 minutes so they could have something to send out for radio shows and keep it fresh. Well, this happened in 1948 with Pee Wee Hunt, and he stopped in Nashville, recorded 12th Street Rag for the transcription. So this was recorded at the end of the session. They thought, well, you got a little extra space. What do you want to put in there? He said, well, we got this silly do-wacka-do arrangement of 12th Street Rag. We'll try that. And it wasn't supposed to be played on the air, but it was, and people started asking for it. So under the auspices of it was recorded for radio, they were able to release it as a single in the middle of 1948 when nobody else could. There's your clarinetist, Rosie McHarg, who later in the year formed his own group in Los Angeles with Marvin Ash as the pianist. So this was recorded in April or early May, came out in June, and by July it hit, no kidding, #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. That is amazing. It means that people wanted the ragtime. Now, I know many have asked me over the years, who was the pianist on this? Well, now you'll know. Carl Fisher, the same guy whose concert hall was played in a year later, and the same guy who had the Carl Fisher Music Company. Now, those of you who are familiar with the works of Lou Busch, Joe Fingers Carr, you will hear some influence from Carl Fisher. Listen to this. I know you've heard this. Very much a style that Lou Busch would do. It was musical comfort food. These guys who came back from the war, there's your do-wacka-do. We're looking for something from the past that was not as unfamiliar as things like bebop and rhythm and blues and so on. And this was it. So this record flew off the shelves. Lou Busch then, who was at Capitol, of course, at the time as the A&R guy, decided to capitalize on it. And he brought in a couple of extra guys, Marvin Ash and Ray Turner, both amazing pianists. And that one recording launched the Capitol Records ragtime branding, with Lou Busch playing, of course, as Joe Fingers Carr. The original honky-tonk piano recording he did not play as that. He played as himself as Lou Busch. Ray Turner took on some of the works of Roy Bargy, and they went very well. Marvin Ash, who'd been recording, Marvin Ash in 1941 or so was in Kansas City, and what is said is that it was Count Basie, Fats Waller, and possibly Joe Sullivan all there playing three pianos. And Marvin Ash said, I want to sound like that, all three of them at once. And he did a pretty good go of it. So there's three phenomenal pianists, and both Marvin Ash and Ray Turner did get their own albums on Capitol and singles as well. Well, Capitol Records was riding the wave of a trend. Other artists, Paul Lingle, Frankie Carle. I love the Frankie Carle. I grew up with that. The Crazy Otto, of course. There's Johnny Maddox, the other Crazy Otto. Winifred Atwell, Down Yonder Del Wood, and Papa John Gordy. My favorite was the Firehouse 5+2. My grandfather was both a musician and a dentist, and he was a dentist for some of the Firehouse, including Ward Kimball, which he knew, and Frank Thomas. So I got to go to these guys' houses when I was growing up. It was a lot of fun. Got to go ride once in the Grizzly Flats. So I heard the Firehouse 5+2 at Disneyland in the 1960s. And believe me, that was a memorable experience. I can never forget that. So I was fortunate in that part of my upbringing. I'm just going to show you a few of these record covers from the 1950s simply because they're crazy. And a lot of them have to do with girls and pianos and beer. So you can see that here. Fred Burton over top right. Knuckle Fingers Joe, how's that for a composite name? Beethoven Ben on the bottom. Crazy Fritz. There's Jimmy White. Just crazy, crazy, crazy. Because everyone was doing a follow-on to Capitol and Frankie Carle, Firehouse Five. Some of these included ensembles, some didn't. Gloves McGinty, what a name, right? Spats Halloran. Oh, Willie Play That Thing. That was Bill Krenz, who was considered to be the tallest ragtime pianist in captivity at 6'5". Del Wood started doing more of those. Wally Rose did a honky-tonk album, even though he didn't really believe so much in honky-tonk as did in ragtime, but he did believe in being recorded and making money. Moving on to a few more of those. I like that Kitten on the Keys. That was Ray Turner. Grandma Merrill. Big Tiny Little. Very popular, of course. Then this one. Why? I don't know. I don't know what this has to do with honky-tonk piano. Guy in his swimsuit. Just weirdest cover of all time. I just thought I would share it. But that was good from 1950 through about maybe 1955, and then something happened. We know it as rock and roll. And these three guys dominated. Carl Perkins is along. Of course, it's Jerry Lee Lewis on the left, Elvis Presley, and Little Richard Penniman over on the right. So rock and roll took a little bit of a chunk out of it, and that was the end of Revival 1A. Well, the industry doubled down, said, we're still going to do this. We're still going to make it popular. And one guy in particular, Enoch Light, helped to keep the revival going on his Waldorf Music Hall and Grand Award labels by inventing some characters. One of them in particular, Knuckles O'Toole, who made a big series of albums. They started out with Goes to Spain, Goes to Paris rather, south of the border, then a bunch of honky-tonk pianos. Of course, my favorite album was down on the lower row, second from the right, Knuckles O'Toole Ragtime. I think it was like a standard issue thing in 1958. Dick Hyman is playing that one. Stars and Stripes Forever in Ragtime. That was a magnificent album and remains so even today. And this Sing a Song, it was one of those Mitch Miller knockoffs, but it was a really good one. So they were brisk sellers because Knuckles O'Toole was a brand name, so to speak. And here's four more that were done by Hyman. Slugger Ryan, who played on a kids show. But some of these I think they're all played by him, but Willie the Rock Knox, that's another one of the names that he used. I think there were 5 or 6 pseudonyms that were used for Hyman, and they recycled the tracks. They just would put them in a different order and release them on a different sub-label. It was quite the racket going on. Then the classic ragtime albums started coming out, what we would now call classic. This is Wally Rose. Now that Ragtime Classics by Wally Rose, there are 2 versions of that. He first recorded it in 1953 for Good Time Jazz, and then came back in 1958 and re-recorded it with new tracks, this time in stereo. So there would be a higher fidelity version of it. That's what this is from. Some of the other ones of note there, and I've given the second one there somewhat of a relook, and that would be Knocky Parker. Now, I take John Parker quite seriously. He was doing the best he could, but while this is supposedly a 2-record set, the complete piano works of Scott Joplin, complete is a point of view because there are virtually no repeats in there. So they're all shortened versions and very little adherence to the original text. So it is a complete piano works, but only an overview. It's I think consider the first real one to be Dick Zimmerman in the 1970s. The Joplin Bouquet, that was Ann Charters, originally Ann Danberg, who was in love with her professor, Sam Charters. And he knew that she played piano, and he was doing some musicology and trying to collect as much as he could of the blues and ragtime. And so he had her record first the Joplin Bouquet and then the Essay in Ragtime in 1958-59. And it was one of the earliest attempts of just piano, no other instrument, trying to emulate what he felt Joplin would want. And it was a very passable thing. Of course, on the left side, we have Max Morath, who you can't say enough about. I've known him for 40 years now. He's a delightful person. And he had a lot to do with this as well. I see someone waiting there. Okay. Apologies for taking so long to get to them. All right. So Max Morath, and Joseph Lamb, that again would be Sam Charters, who went to his house in 1958 and recorded an evening with the aging Mr. Lamb playing some of his own pieces. But one of the works we really need to regard was one done by Bob Darch in 1960, The Golden Reunion in Ragtime. Where you see U.B. Blake, Joe Jordan, and Charles Thompson, who all played for about an hour and 45 minutes worth of recordings. Some of it was put into a radio show, which became popular for a while, and the rest put onto this album. And that was them, of course, playing Joe Jordan's Teasing Rag. This had an influence in the media somewhat, but not a long-lasting effect. So now we're going to go to Revival 1C. It sort of died around 1960, but shortly after, Max Morath hit the airwaves, and he tried to revive it on what was the origination of public television. It was the Educational Television Network at that time, or National Educational Television. So he came out and did his Ragtime Years and another show. Also on the Lawrence Welk Show, which always had Big Tiny Little. In 1960, Joanne Castle took over for him. She was an accordion player who turned out to be a pretty good ragtime pianist. I played with her once back in the 1980s, and she was a very wonderful human being as well. Had gone through a lot of adversity in her life. So I admire how just stick-to-itiveness that she had. But hopefully you'll be able to hear this. I'm going to have to take it up a little bit. This was broadcast on NBC in 1960. Those Ragtime Years. Now that's Ralph Sutton playing the Maple Leaf Rag. Ralph Sutton being a pretty decent stride pianist. I'm sorry, we had sound issues, so this is the best I can do. And next to him is a younger player, Dick Wellstood. This is a one-camera shot, by the way, keep in mind. And he hands it off to U.B. Blake. That this exists is a miracle. And then he's going to hand it off to Hoagie Carmichael. Oh boy, to be in that room, huh? And now they all go full force into the trio. Now, Yubi told Terry Waldo a couple of times that he was hanging on for dear life, and especially at the end, he just started playing the high notes on the piano so he could be heard. Because now we come into the Wilbur de Paris band, who are accompanying them. One camera shot. This is amazing. Crane shot yet. You can hear UV clink, 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 clink. That is 2.5 minutes of pure joy. And that show got some pretty high ratings. It was on NBC. It was not on some kind of educational television. So we had folios. Some of you have seen those folios. One of them, of course, of Joseph Lamb originals. We got Play Them Rags, Ragtime Piano. I have those folios. And that's where I started learning some of this stuff, even when I was 8 or 9 years old. My mom just went out and got them. Bob Darch started holding local festivals and events in historic locations. Of course, he was famous for playing in Nevada quite often, but he had a regular gig down in Miami, another one up in Toronto, all over the country. He loved to play in St. Louis whenever he could. And Bob, he's sort of like a behind the scenes. He's like the Colonel Tom Parker for everybody. He was promoting all of us, and he was a decent player too. I liked Bob. I knew him for his last 12 years, and he was just always very open. I learned how to get stories out of him. I would ask him the same questions on 3 different occasions, and everything that overlaid, that was probably the correct story, because he was quite a character, and he may yet still have guest of honor buried somewhere. We don't know. But Bob Darch, in having all of these events, started to ignite local interests in places, including in Sedalia, Missouri. And then in St. Louis, the Goldenrod Ragtime Festival. Some of us have been to that. It started drawing fans, and it became known nationwide. It would make the news now and then. So it was wonderful. I've had many talks with Trevor on that, Trevor Tishner. He started this in 1965 with his St. Louis Ragtimers and a few friends. And Dave Jason soon came on, and they helped restore this marvelous boat, which was burned down to the hull a few years ago. But from 1965 to 1989, they held it in St. Louis, and then a few years, for a few more years, up the river. So the Goldenrod was a big launching point for the fact you can have an annual festival, and it can be focused on traditional rags and traditional jazz, like the Dixieland is what we refer to. But ragtime died again, right? It's a dearth of ragtime outside of festivals, nostalgic venues. But something happened. I mean, the guys who were seriously working behind the scenes then, Dick Zimmerman started the Maple Leaf Club with several of his colleagues in Los Angeles. And then you have Bill Bolcom and Bill Albright, who are doing what they can to write new rags and get some recordings out there. Bill Bolcom got his first recording out in 1967. He would later go on to win a Pulitzer Prize for some of his beautiful works, I think Garden of Eden. But there was one particular person, a concert pianist, who had taken an interest in Joplin after hearing the Charters albums and a few others, and said, we should have an entire collection of Scott Joplin. And that would be Vera Brodsky Lawrence, who managed to get everything except the rights to 3 rags. Unfortunately, Jerry Vogel would not let go of those 3 rags, which would be Searchlight, Fig Leaf, and I forgot the third one. Roseleaf. Those 3 he wouldn't let go of, but the rest of them, there they were, all stuck in these books. And you can bet I had that in 1970 and started learning my Joplin out of there, which was interesting for an elementary school kid, but and occasionally some derision came from that, but whatever. And then in 1970, Nonsuch released their first album played by Joshua Rifkin, who was working in league with Lawrence. And boy, I'll tell you what, things that change your life, that Green album changed my life. Maple Leaf I already knew, The Entertainer I had already learned, but then you go to side 2 and there's Gladiolus Rag, Fig Leaf Rag, Magnetic Rag. Gladiolus Rag was the first one that gave me that weird and intoxicating feeling that Scott Joplin talks about. Now, let me be clear. The weird and intoxicating feeling is not the same as playing for weird and intoxicated people. I've done that as well. It does happen. but I did enjoy that. And these changed a lot of people's lives, and one in particular. So, and then I will tell the story in brief. George Roy Hill. That's the name. In 1967, he had done a little film called Thoroughly Modern Millie, which had ragtime in it. And 1969, he had Burt Bacharach sort of come up with something ragtime-ish for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So he was reviewing, while he was making the sting, some gangster films to see what music was used in those 1930s gangster films. And he came across The Public Enemy, which had ragtime in it. And he knew it wasn't exactly period proper, but he thought, we don't have to have music all through this, but I want this ragtime because it conveys the feeling that I want. So he had heard the ragtime through a nephew who had the Rifkin recordings and who was also learning it. Then he bought the music and started learning the pieces because he thought he was going to play them for the film. He just did not have enough time and found out he didn't quite have the skill set, even though he's a good pianist. So he called Gunther Schuller, who'd done the Redback Book, the recording on Angel Records of the Joplin rags played with orchestrations. Well, Gunther said, I don't have the time. I'm working on getting this opera staged in a year or so. And that, of course, would be Treemonisha. So Gunther said, if you can find someone else, you can borrow my orchestrations. So he found someone else. That would, of course, famously be Marvin Hamlish, who was able to take the spaces between scenes. There's very little music behind the scenes. It's mostly in between them and during chase scenes and the like. And admittedly, Marvin did himself a service, at the same time doing some of us players a disservice. Like anytime we get to the trio of this piece, people will come up and say, well, what was that other piece you were playing? Or when you're playing the beginning of Solace, what was that other piece you were playing? It was Solace. It doesn't matter. So this became a top 40 hit. It actually rose to, I think, number 8 or 7 on the Billboard Top 100. And the album was number 1 for several weeks in 1974. Number 1 album of a film soundtrack comprised mostly of ragtime. We were in a revival, ladies and gentlemen, and it took serious hold. And I have to admit, Hamlish did us a favor for a while. He even occasionally admitted that Scott Joplin was the composer. That was sometimes hard information to go by. And it gave exposure to Joplin. He did not always receive his due, but his name was at the Academy Awards. And I'm sure many people were startled and said, what? A black man named Scott? I had heard that one before. Of course, those who were performing in the 70s and 80s, myself included, often had this cry, this plaintive cry from Shakespeare, O sting, where is thy death? Because it got to be quite a bit. And then, of course, Treemonisha came out, Houston Grand Opera under Gunther Schuller, and it was on video and won a Grammy for the recording. It was also magnificent. We were in our second ragtime revival, fully. Yay! So how did that look? Well, there were a slew of Joplin-centric albums recorded, including for rock band, harpsichord, synthesizer, multiple pianos, and many more. I don't know how many all of you have. I have 180 records just between 1970 and 1989. Of course, by 1990, records were temporarily passé. Of course, vinyl is back in now. So most of it was CD. So I only count records. But the fact that we had this sustainable amount of recordings up through almost 1990 was marvelous. And then they were re-released on CDs, of course. Then there was the Ozark Music Festival, which came the week before the first Scott Joplin Festival. And there it goes. the Ozark Festival was supposed to be just like Woodstock 2. It was not. It was a disaster. The people of Sedalia were horrified with the treatment that some of these kids gave them. Some of them were nice and many of them were not. And what they found out is that originally this is supposed to be a folk festival. And then they said, oh yeah, a folk festival, and we're going to have all of the big rock bands in America there at the Sedalia Fairgrounds. Well, the week after that, and I have interviewed many who were there, people come into town to play ragtime, and they were finding a somewhat not hostile, but askance eye looking at them. We don't need more musicians in this town. Well, fortunately, the ragtime crowd, which is Bob Darch again on the left, was very well behaved, and it turned out to be a success, so much so they did it again in 1975. And that was the start of the Scott Joplin Music Festival. Old ragtime saloons were in vogue again. Oh my, what do you know? Can you believe? I can't. I look at it. 39 years ago when that picture was taken. And I haven't changed one bit. I've changed about 800 bits. So, but I will be in that same saloon, which has that same wallpaper and those same chairs and walls and all, again this summer, which I've done for several years now, the Diamond Bell Saloon in Durango, Colorado, which is still alive and kicking. COVID tried to kill it, but it's back, baby. Folios appeared in print, many of them. We know of the Dover folios, those of us who know of ragtime and even traditional jazz. And those folios provide us with a lot. I'm slow at admitting people here. Provide us with a lot of material. The All-American Ragtime was just reprints of stuff. I never saw that as terribly useful. But the one in the middle, that was a Dave Jason thing. He also divided it into 2 sets of 50 authentic rags. So these things are now repurposed, not all available, but so much music is available online now, it seems to not matter. Then the stamp came out. Now, as I said, the Scott Joplin Festival went to 1975. Well, citizens of Sedalia and organizers of the new Scott Joplin International Ragtime Festival managed to get the stamp into production at the post office, and they introduced it in Sedalia that year in 1982, and there has been a festival yearly, except for the last 2 years. We've had a virtual festival, but yearly since then. There will be one this year, the first week of June. I will be presenting there as well, except I'll be focused on the honky-tonk part of this presentation. And we will have some fine ragtimers from that era, from the honky-tonk and beyond. Virginia Eskin will be there presenting. So if you can try and get there and not miss it, please do. So Tower Records classified many ragtime albums as Americana or classical. This was a big deal. That was one of my favorite havens growing up, and that is the Tower Records on Sunset Boulevard. This picture is actually taken across the street from the classical store of Tower Records. They had 2. That's the rock store, rock and jazz, and then behind the camera is the classical. I spend many, many hours and many, many dollars I'd earned from babysitting and yard work in those stores. And even after I moved to Colorado, I'd go back to California, spend more. And when I moved to DC, Tower Records was just wonderful. Papers were written, degrees were obtained focusing on ragtime. Mine was on American ethnomusicology. Didn't really exist. I sort of wrote the parameters for it, and I think many people have since got it. So the one that you see on the right, that's Brian S. Wright. You might want to look this up. The Ragtime Piano Revival in America. It's similar to this topic's, a little more focused on the community aspect of it. But those of you know who Brian Wright, you know that it's stellar work, and it does talk about the traditional jazz world as well. And I just want to say a sideline, where ragtime went, traditional jazz went, and many people could not find much of a separation line between the two. So I played with lots of traditional jazz band. Platte River Jazz Band. I got to play with them a few times in Denver, and many Colorado and since then DC area bands. I've occasionally been able to sit on a piano and enjoy, and especially in Missouri when we have pickup bands. So traditional jazz and ragtime do go hand in hand, and there's a lot of crossover. New books, new research appeared. You can see Terry Waldo's book, which is UB-centric. Rags and Ragtime, 1978, later 1989, renewed. The King of Ragtime by Berlin. And Dave Jason, who's written a series of books, Tin Pan Alley, That American Rag Encyclopedia. These helped supplant parts of They All Played Ragtime. They All Played Ragtime is an important book, but it is flawed in part because it was so focused on the narrative of what was going on in the ragtime. You couldn't deconstruct. I tried to reconstruct it from the narrative, and I showed it to Jason, and he looked at one chapter, and there was more annotation than there was content. He said, "Why don't you write your own?" You know, those of you who know Jason know exactly what he said. So I did, and there's another one coming soon. Well, the one surviving entity from the era became a celebrity again. That was Yubi. The scene on the left you see is from Saturday Night Live in March of 1979, season 4, when Yubi Blake was the oldest ever and still remains the oldest ever musical guest on Saturday Night Live. Gregory Hines is behind him, who at that time was on Broadway doing the musical Yubi. And it's so funny because Yubi saying, "Oh, I wrote this. I'm just wild about Harry. Originally as a waltz. And you know who I am, don't you?" And Hines is like, "Yeah, I know who you are." It was delightful. I just was tickled to death. I wasn't even 20 years old yet. I met Yubi when I was 12, and I was just so fascinated. So this was a beautiful moment to have him on Saturday Night Live. Look it up sometime. There were several festivals and events, but again, we have short attention spans in this country. And the sting was no more. Although I still get asked for that piece. I say, "You mean the entertainer, or do you want to hear something called the sting?" So, yeah, I know. So ragtime looked to be dead again. I mean, is it ever going to get respect? Dun, 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 dun. Well, maybe not so dead. There was a third revival in the works. When did it start? I don't know, 1995, 96, but it had to do with what we're doing right now. The bulletin boards on the internet started growing, and there was just a niche for everything. All of these great groups, including ragtime, and I found one on CompuServe, if anyone remembers that. When I started hooking in online in 1994, it wasn't really the growth. You needed something more palpable and understandable for that. So a group got together, they created the World Wide Web, HTML technology, and the Lycos search engine. Oh, that was delightful. Trying to get placed on that, you had to petition why your site's so important to get put on it. Now, man, I try to have mine removed from some of them. But the World Wide Web suddenly made instant sharing. I was discovered by a lot of people. A lot of people discovered me. So first thing I did as soon as I could get a website together, I did, as did many other people. So there you see John Roach. A lot of you will remember he did some of the best work of Robin Frost stuff ever. It was fantastic. Victor Herbert, the Primeline MIDI library, that was a weird hybrid. Parlor Songs still in existence. Ragtime Press, Sue Keller, my friend. These were just some of the early sites, but they were portals where people could go and hear and read about ragtime. Be known that when I first loaded up my site, I was trying to sell my music on cassettes. I know it's pathetic. And then CDs. But I also put up some of the songs so people could hear and little explanations. And people started asking me questions. Well, where was this composer from? Was it a man or a woman if it's an initial? When was it? And they started asking me questions that engaged me. So I started putting out more information. Now I don't care if I don't sell anything. It's about sharing the joy of the music. And I know all of you are quite aware of that. Then universities and libraries. I don't know how I got Star Wars in there. Somehow I did. Anyhow, these libraries started popping up. The first one I ran into was the Lester S. Levy, because they popped on around 1996, maybe 1995. They were a great source. For a while, I'd still say that the best sources for ragtime in particular are Chip Templeton's collection, Chip down in Mississippi. I've been in that library a couple of times. It's beautiful. And I love this music. So I've done some work with them. And the Indiana Harmony has a lot of ragtime. So now you don't have to buy these folios because a lot of this music is available for free because it's in the public domain. It wasn't always, because Sonny Bono, who was in Congress, helped pen an act at the behest of the Gershwin family and Disney, the Copyright Term Extension Act, which I don't know, I'm mixed on. I do like to see copyright protections, but 95 years after the composer's death, come on, George Gershwin's third, fourth grandchild or whatever, get your own job. Irving Berlin's great nephew, just go out and find some work of some kind. To a point, it gets ridiculous. But for Disney, it was protecting things like Minnie's Yoo-Hoo and some of their other original music. And for the Gershwins, when this came out in 1998, it was for protecting Rhapsody in Blue, which was going to be up the next year in the public domain. And they wanted United Airlines to keep paying for it very seriously. So they extended it 20 years. We are now at a point where we have public domain pieces up through 1926. So we waited. The risk of this, of course, was for 20 years where we could have maybe put these pieces out without being chased down by ASCAP, BMI, or the Fox organization. We took that risk of nobody performing the music at all because it cost too much to do so, and then that music gets lost. Fortunately, a lot of that has not happened, and some of it's being rediscovered. Bulletin boards gave way to the social media, which we know, MP3s, M4As, which is the iPod version of the MP3. They had recordings along with requisite issues. If you remember Napster, just putting stuff out there. It's still done. Yahoo and Facebook. Yahoo had some of the great groups, but now I'm on no less than 11 groups on Facebook, which focus on old music, ragtime, traditional jazz. And that's where we share information anymore, which is fantastic. YouTube allowed anybody to share their new material, but it also seemed to skirt some copyright laws. So I've had some of my stuff posted on YouTube without asking, but at least it's being heard, right? We've got to look at it from that point of view. Postmodern Jukebox. If you don't know them, and I think most of you do, look them up. Scott Bradley, I've talked to him. He's a really cool guy. He likes to take today's music and reconvert it into traditional jazz, ragtime, swing jazz. He does a wonderful job, and more people actually, when they watch his live broadcasts when he does ragtime style, they get interested in this music. We're hoping to get him to Sedalia next year, so that'd be kind of fun. So now what? Now what? Here are the questions, and maybe you'll have answers because I'm about done. How do we disseminate this music responsibly? It's so hard. I mean, I have a bunch of pieces out there, and I don't want to necessarily give my own intellectual works out for free, but the way to disseminate seems to be digital now, and I'm yes and no on that. We're in a sensitive area. How do we reconcile some of the currency and liabilities of ragtime music? And let's admit, the music itself is blameless, even though some of it was maybe hijacked by white people. It wasn't 100% originated by Black people either. It's homogeny of how ragtime came apart or came about, and I'm not going to go into that detail right now, but some of it was abused, particularly in songs, the lyrics, and also on sheet music covers. Now, I heard one call for one person. Let's just draw new covers for everything and redistribute the music. That's not going to solve the issue. We need to recognize it for what it is. I know we are probably, none of our kids will ever see a film like Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips, which was controversial even during World War II, but more so now. But it's history. Somehow we got to get out there, and someday Disney's going to find a way to bring out Song of the South. And if they can do that, we can do something with this. It's contextual presentation. How do we encourage younger audiences? Now listen, ragtime was a music for the young. Ragtime was a music created by the young. Ragtime was enjoyed by the young. It's the rock and roll of its era. We have lots of young players. I know most of them. They gravitate towards me. I encourage them. I think it's great. I knew Adam Swanson when he was 11, and now he's an absolute beast at 30, doing some amazing things. There's a local kid, Vincent Wilson, very good at learning it at 14. But they're the players. We need the audiences. How do we get high school kids to say, well, this is good alternative? We don't always have to be listening to Kanye or whatever it is this week. Don't have to always be listening to Olivia Rodrigo. We can hear ragtime too. I would like that. So I think that has to start in the elementary schools. I don't know about in Florida, but we can give it a try. And no offense meant there. It's just a little humor. Is there a way to rebrand this music or make it more palatable? That's an open question. Do we need another Sting or a Broadway show? I am working on the latter. It's going to be a year before you hear much about it, but it could happen. Look what Hamilton did. So who knows? If we do it right, we'll bring attention to it. How do we cultivate more performance venues? There's one of the problems. You can find a lot of bars that have open mic night and so on, but they don't want to hear ragtime. I'm lucky enough to be able to go to a saloon 3-4 weeks every year and play. Then the people there want to hear what I'm doing. But how do we get other performance venues and local festivals? I mean, you probably know about this with Potomac River Jazz Club, is how do we get more of these venues where we can go in with the older jazz, not just the Dixieland stuff, but stuff from the 1910s and the 1920s. It's an open question. And finally, can ragtime ever be cool again and not canceled? I want to say yes, because I'm an eternal optimist. I've been told I'm worse than a hopeless romantic because I'm a hopeful romantic. But yes, I want it to not be canceled and be cool. There have been questions over the past 2 years. And if you don't think George Floyd plays into ragtime, I've had discussions. I had one last year online for the Scott Joplin Festival, and it does. It's a perception of where the music came from and how the people, many of them wrote it, were treated. So these are a lot of questions to tread carefully. And I don't know that we're the ones. Anyhow, there's that, and that is there. Is ragtime dead? Hold on, wait for it, wait for it. Resurrection of ragtime. I appreciate you being here. And now I'll hand it back to Ellie and we'll handle questions.
All right. Awesome. When you were talking about some of that at the end about, inspiring new viewers and audiences, I was thinking about Scott Bradley, and there's some of this same discussion in New Orleans about trying to keep younger folks coming into the fold, and that whole idea of reinventing it, and that it doesn't have to be just the older songs. You can bring these newer songs in and play them in the older styles that gets the younger folks going, oh, I know that song, and then, and it makes that the styling of it novel and more appealing. And I think I mean, Scott Bradley, he started out on piano, like at a piano bar doing that, right, reinventing songs, and he really is just a genius in his arrangements and stuff, and he has such great talent that he feeds into that. So yeah, we need more of that, not just on the big national big acts, but we need to in our own little niche areas figure out that ways to do that, ways to bring those folks in.
Well, we've had a conversation, hopefully getting to Sedalia, just him, for one night next year, and that would be fun. It would re-energize things. So, yeah.
Any questions from studio audience? Sorry for some of the technology weirdness earlier. Any other questions?
I have a few. I don't want to cut anybody.
Oh, go ahead, Rob. Go ahead, get us started.
Well, there's a few actually that come to mind. First, anecdotally, with respect to your point, Bill, about having had a discussion about George Floyd playing into ragtime, I remember seeing a review of an album, I think by John Arpin, playing songs related to Al Jolson, and somebody saying, "Oh gosh, why don't we get together and black our faces and sing along?" And of course,
Got to separate them. You got to separate them.
Just isn't the point. With respect to ragtime becoming palatable and appealing to young audiences, I wonder, do you think it gets caught on the horns of the highbrow, lowbrow problem? Certainly, there was associated with the whole Joshua Rifkin revolution, whether he was playing ragtime as it was originally conceptualized, as opposed to the tech piano style of ragtime that was so much a part of let's see, would it have been 1B or 1C?
1A and 1B,
1B,
because they took the upright pianos that had been in the honky-tonk piano or honky-tonk bars of the 10s and 20s and didn't modify them. They're just pianos that are old, had hardened hammers, and some people put tacks in them. So yeah, that's how the sound came about in the 1950s. I'll go into more detail in Sedalia this year, but yeah, it's unfortunate. But.
So do you think the somewhat classical character of ragtime, which I think still sort of persists, is part of the problem of drawing younger audiences?
Maybe, but there's an approach many of us are taking, and many of us were in a similar group. It's myself, Brian Holland, Jeff Barnhart, Richard Dowling. When we come to our concerts anymore, we don't get dressed up with armbands and the vests and the whole thing. Just wear, like, I have a sharkskin suit. I want to look good out there. And I'm not playing on a tricked up piano. I'm just playing the music on a piano, saying, come along with me. This is a fun journey. So we're not trying to present it in period. We're just trying to, you don't see the classical musicians of the LA Philharmonic or the Washington in powdered wigs playing, right?
Right.
This is not old music. This is music. And if you present it that way, you can actually get quite a bit of traction.
So you make it part of the present. One last question. I mean, all of these are open for a lengthy discussion.
Right.
You've only spoken about piano ragtime. Is there any tension between piano and orchestral ragtime?
Orchestral ragtime, well, let's look at how a lot of that came about. I mean, you go to some of your great publishers in New York at that time, they were given piano rags, and what they would do is they released orchestrated versions. They had somebody on their staff who would take a line and make it could be flute or oboe because everything was doubled, or violin or something, and then they'd hand them out. So they were essentially playing, for the most part, except on Broadway or in vaudeville, playing piano ragtime orchestrated. So there's not that much distinction. Early ragtime, of course, in the mid to late 1890s, a lot of that was dance music. So it was designed for that type of performance. But by 1910, all you had to do was write a piano rag, and it was eventually going to get orchestrated.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating.
Oh, great. Thank you. Next.
I just want to acknowledge, what you covered here. And also it was like a trip down memory lane, because
Right.
I was like, I've got some of those albums. I have the Joplin rag book sitting over there. My introduction to this came from several directions, including the Mickey Mouse Club when I was a kid, which was, I think, when it was new. Actually, I'm that old. And Max Morath on educational television. It was a real treat many years later to meet Max and tell him how I'd enjoyed his shows on, back in those days. And I met Yubi also when he played in Baltimore in 1978 for his birthday party.
Mhm.
I also remember, Rob, you once hosted a showing of that entire Ragtime Years show at the Library of Congress.
Oh, okay.
You remember, a long time ago.
Yeah, your memory's better than mine. I guess
Well,
that's
I think
right.
I don't know how, it was a long time ago. I don't really remember, 20 years, but it was in the Pickford Auditorium. They showed the whole program.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I also know that guys like myself and Brian and we used to always be looking up at, oh wow, Max Morath and John Arpin and all these magnificent players, and boy, I want to be like them. And now we have to look over our shoulders because we got these kids in their teens and 20s who are really darn good, and we have to make sure that we're good examples for them. Max always had time for me, going back to 1982 when I first met him. Always has had time for me, and I have to say, I mean, we remain friends. It's been a couple of years since I've been to see him, but I do talk to him. The biggest moment in my life, professionally, involves Max Morath, when in 2016, the people Scott Joplin Foundation, not asking if I cared that I'm not old enough, gave me the Lifetime Achievement Award, but to do it, they brought Max in because Max wanted to give it. And just to have the guy who you've spent so many years admiring just say, and here's your award, Bill. So I'm that to some people now. Brian Holland is that to some people now. We are aware of where we are, and we know that the music could live or die based on our attitude towards certain people. This was told to me once by Mel Torme. I was playing at the Ritz-Carlton in Tyson's, and people kept asking for songs like "You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To" and "Give Me the Simple Life" and all this. There's a theme here. Why are people asking for these songs? And someone came up and asked for the Christmas song in July. Why? Says, didn't you see over there? There's Mel, and there he is sitting in a corner in a chair with a couple of friends. But he came over. He's very nice, very nice. Said, "Don't worry, this happens to me a lot of places I go. I feel bad for the pianist. You handled it well. Here's my advice. Some of these pieces that people ask for are so important to them. You may not like Waltzing Matilda. You may get a little bit tired of playing Dill Pickles, but to the person who's asking, that may be the thing they most want to hear at that moment because they think you can do justice to it. Do that whether you like it or not, and make it fresh and make it good." So, and he was right. And so I try to do that now, whether it's the blue hairs, and there are a lot of blue hairs because I play in retirement homes, or it's these kids who heard me on YouTube playing something. So our attitude is a part of the discussion underneath that we have to consider in order to keep this music alive. All of us, and all of you as jazz fans or jazz players as well.
I think Ed also might have had a question.
Sure. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what's ragtime and not. I just play the music. I don't know all the things you guys do, but I just love it. So one thing's been really bothering me, and you guys might know the answer, which is, I swear, in the early '70s, after a gig, I saw a late night. I was kind of half conscious and half buzzed going to sleep. But there was a movie of a jazz band playing China Boy, and it was a murder movie. And like one one by one, the musicians were getting pulled in the back and murdered. And was I seeing things and imagining things, or is this an actual movie?
I think that was a Benny Goodman movie, maybe, or Glenn Miller, one of those, possibly.
Okay.
Because I recall seeing something like that at some point.
Yeah, this is kind of an elusive, weird thing. I swear to God it existed. Nobody believes
I
me.
think it
And it's
does
funny 'cause
exist.
I was learning China Boy on the banjo at the
Yeah.
time, and I loved playing that. And then I said, "This is the one where the guys got murdered one by one."
Well, you sit down with
Hollywood and everything. I thought maybe you'd know this.
Well, yeah, you just and some people will challenge you. I mean, I was at piano at Sedalia once, and Frederick sat down, Frederick Hodges, and said, "Let's do China Boy," and he starts playing. I go, "Did you ask if I know it?"
Yeah.
Fortunately, I did, but yeah, it's challenges like that. And China Boy is a good one, though.
I'm sorry, I can't find my copy of Jazz in the Movies, which
Oh.
might solve that, but I don't know exactly where it is on the shelf.
You guys
Well,
can
I
connect.
listen to you every week for 40 years, Rob, and I know if anybody knows stuff, it would be you.
Oh, only if I can find the book,
That's
but
So
you're very
I got
kind.
China Boy off of. I used to hang around with Earl Roberts, who was the tenor banjo player in the NBC orchestra,
Oh,
and I kind of just steal stuff off people. So he kind of showed me how he did it, and I went to see him at his home, and it was so he had a publicity photo from the 20s when he was in the NBC orchestra. It was him water skiing playing the banjo, and he was. These guys were really cool when he met them.
Hey, anything else?
Well, I think this was fantastic. Thank you so much. Great presentation and hearing your stories and just learning more about the history of it. I thought it was very well put together and really enjoyed it myself. So yeah, we really appreciate you doing that for us, and maybe we can have you back doing another one a little down the road too.
Well, I have two books in, they're well beyond incubation stage. In fact, they're getting close to editing. The first one is called They All Made Ragtime, and it doesn't just go through the composers and the musicians, but it talks about everybody who's involved with it, including a consumer who had, of course, a big
wonderful.
pull in this. And you'd be surprised, one of my chapters is about the economy, the ripple effect that ragtime had in the economy, which it came during a depression in the 1890s. You think, what is it played on? It's in pianos. And suddenly pianos come popular. So you have pianos are going to be in homes, and the Sears catalog comes out and they sell pianos. So now you need lumbermen to cut wood for pianos and for keys. And then you need more steel mills who are able to make the plates and the strings. And then you need more technicians to put them together and to tune them, more delivery men, and you need more players everywhere from bars to houses of ill repute. So there's a big ripple effect from that, and that's part of They All Made Ragtime. And then the second one's going to be Honky-Tonk Piano, which is ostensibly going to cover 1930 to 1960 something.
Ragtime ever do anything for the thumbtack industry?
Oh man. See, why would anyone want to do that to a piano?
I
Split
know.
the hammers open.
I know. I had to ask.
As a piano technician, I did encounter a lot of those when I was in Colorado. Yeah. And the pianos last a long time there because it was dry in Southwest Colorado. But gosh, why are my hammers splitting apart? Did you put tacks in them? Yeah. Why would you want that sound? All right. Why would you want to detune your piano like Enoch Light liked his pianos detuned for knuckles? Okay. Anything else?
I think that's it. We'll wrap it on up, and I will. Everybody will get an email through the Eventbrite thing when the video is posted on YouTube, and I'll also send you a link, Bill, on it, and we'll see y'all next month. I'm waiting for a confirmation for our next speaker, so I'll get that information up in the next week or two. Thanks for joining us. I hope so.
Everyone stay safe and stay well.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.